Well, hello again, everyone. Today, my video will be giving a brief overview and some background about who I am and where I am today. Also, a little bit on what motivates me to do the things that I do. So, if you're new to my channel, my name is Sarah. I am a former foster youth and homeless young adult who ended up in her adult life transferring to Yale University, where I received my bachelor's degree before going on to do 2 master's degrees. And now I'm at Oxford University, beginning the academic journey to complete my academic journey of PhD in international relations. And it wasn't an easy journey to where I am today. And I had to come with my motivation and really establish that motivation. So let's get right into that. What does that mean? What is my motivation? I am motivated to end suffering because I believe that it is the only way to move forward in our communities, to build happier, healthier communities, and also ensure positive public health outcomes and reduce the instance of conflict and rate of people who are in the criminal justice system. But I wouldn't be motivated like I am today if I didn't experience that suffering myself. So I feel it in my core, this deep understanding what it means to come from a difficult background. But also, after a lot of thinking, I mean, we're each and every one of us are unique individuals, and I think that what really helped me, or what helped me to kind of move out of that situation, a piece of that was because I am neurodivergent, so I wasn't responding normally to abnormal situations. Or maybe in some instances I was responding normally. I mean, there's a lot of different factors and we can get into some of those in future videos, but for today I think it's important, just for the purposes of focusing this video and also building a baseline understanding of who I am and how I got here, so that we can progress to further videos of more substantive information and such. So, my early life, I don't have a ton of memories. I have some, but my very early childhood, my dad, so I came from a drug addicted household. My dad is a lifelong opioid addict, and he's pretty open about that. And my mother struggles with her own traumas. And she did the best she could, and does the best she could, and she's fantastic. But when I was 13, I ended up in the foster care system. My mother had moved from Illinois back to Minnesota. We had kind of moved back and forth throughout my childhood. And she moved back to Rochester, Minnesota when I was 13 years old, when she made the final decision to split off from my father completely. And during that time, I was quite upset. I entered into middle school. Middle school is hard. Moved to a new state. My mother left my father, and then I of course was having like normal responses to that on top of the normal, that age difficulties with hormones and such. So my mother called social services and she asked them for help. She said that she needed either a big brother or big sister program to come and help me because she didn't have time to spend with me like I needed. She didn't have the time to support me when she had to work a full-time job and maintain a household and parent 2 other children. Instead of helping me though, I was removed from my home and entered into the foster care system. And I'm not going to go too deep into what happened in the foster care system. All I can really say is I didn't know much neglect or abuse until I entered into the foster care system, and then I experienced a lot of trauma in that space. I was bounced around from one foster home to another until I was 16 years old, when I found out that I was pregnant with a child. And this part is probably one of the most difficult parts, and it's probably a pivotal point in my life. But the social services, and I was in courtrooms all the time, but the social worker told me, or the courts told me, that I'm basically emancipated, and I was essentially kicked out of the foster care system. By that point, my mother had reached a breaking point. She had been through so much trauma, living with an opioid addict for 18 years, and then having me taken from her home. It was all quite difficult. So she struggled to be very supportive of me. So I mean, it was quite a turbulent time, and for some of that time, I lived outside. I was homeless and 16, pregnant with a child, in the Minnesota winter, which is quite frigid and cold. And I was lucky enough to meet a very, very old homeless man who took me in, and he took in 2 young adult men, and we lived in the trailer of a truck that was just kind of sitting in a parking lot, just hanging out there, which enabled us to stay warm. So he kept us warm and fed. My diet consisted of dumpster donuts. So he would go and get donuts or sandwiches out of the dumpster from like gas stations or other places. And we would all cuddle together to stay warm in the trailer of this truck that was just sitting there, like a semi-trailer truck. I eventually, so throughout that time, I had to reflect a lot. I had stopped my education at 13 years old, so in the 6th grade if you're in the US. And so I decided that I would get my GED when I was pregnant. So I went and I took the exam and I got my GED. By the time I had him, I had obtained my own apartment. I enrolled, like shortly after I had him, I enrolled in community college, and I was also working part-time at a Taco Bell. Now that was complicated in itself because I couldn't get more than a part-time job without parental consent, being under the age of 18, and I just didn't have the ability to get that parental consent. So I have him, and I kept him for 14 months. I loved him. I nursed him. I did quite well in community college at Rochester Community and Technical College. And but then at the age of 18, because I didn't have very much support, I ended up giving him up for adoption about a week after my 18th birthday. It was one of the most devastating periods of my life. I didn't think I would make it out of it, but I did. So I defected from traditional society and the standards, and I decided instead that I was going to find a different way of life. So I started hitchhiking across the country, and I had this little dog since I was 9 years old, and I would carry her on my back as I hitchhiked across the country. And I went to rainbow gatherings and really started to build a community. I had this vision to build a community where we helped one another, where people were just okay and they had what they needed and they weren't judged, and that we came together to really build a solid community, because I didn't think that was possible within the constructs of society, of traditional society. That wasn't until one day. So I guess let me pause there for just a second, because I think that there's another pivotal moment, and that was when I was in Florida. I found out I was pregnant with another child. This time I was in my early 20s, and I was a lot better equipped to care for a child. So after swearing off of money, so during that time prior to finding out I was pregnant, I swore off of money. I traded my labor for things like room and board, and I just completely did things in a different way. And it worked. I met beautiful, beautiful people, and it was a beautiful time in my life. So then when, fast forward, I find out I'm pregnant with this child. I'm canoeing the backwoods of Florida. So I have my canoe, and we used to just tie it up and sit and set up camp on the side of the river there in Florida. So at that point, at the point of which I find out I'm pregnant, I realized that it's no longer safe to stay with people I didn't know or get into cars with people I didn't know, that wasn't really a good position to put a child in. So I started working while I was pregnant, odds and ends jobs to come up with enough money to purchase a little minivan. And then of which I turned this minivan into a little home with a bed in the back, and this was before van life was a thing. And then I started to travel around the country in that way. I ended up delivering my child in Boulder, Colorado. He's now 14, and it was really an interesting time. And so I continued to live this way until one day I walk in to the Walmart parking lot, or I find myself with my baby in the parking lot of a Walmart. And I walk in, and then there's this woman who is gathering signatures. She's carrying a baby on her back. She asked me if I want to sign this petition. I had never seen anything like that before. We don't really have those in Minnesota, ballot initiatives in that way. She's like, yeah, we're gathering signatures to get this on the ballot so voters can make a choice and vote on it. I'm like, wait a minute, what? You can do that? I then carried on into Walmart, got the things that I needed, toothpaste, diapers, those types of things. I came back out, and then I went in. I went back and forth in a couple of times, and later on that day, there was a man standing there in front of the Walmart instead. And we got to talking, and he said, hey, why don't you come and do this? Why don't you come to morning meeting? So I did. The very next day, I showed up at the morning meeting, and I started petitioning. And to me, it was more than just this is a way to make an income. For me, it was a representation of people having power. It just triggered something inside of me. I said, wait a minute, if we have power, that changes everything. We can make sure people are okay. And people do have a voice. So I ended up being really, really good at circulating petitions. And I quickly went from a petitioner to a manager to running my own company. Dealing in direct voter access or in electoral politics. And so I did some political consulting. And I did that for several years. But I kept finding myself throughout these years saying that people don't have adequate representation. And I quickly came to realize that just like me, there were so many victims of a system that wasn't set up to address the need sufficiently. And that's mostly, I would later come to learn that that's because most people who make it into positions of making policies don't really come from the needs. So it's difficult to to understand what those barriers are. I'll get into that a little bit more later on. After several years of doing this, I end up going to a memorial service in Washington, D.C. for the former historian of the White House. And with death, it brings reflection. So after that memorial service, I found myself at a bar in D.C. Now, I don't really drink much, but it was hard to find seating, so we sat there and ate dinner. And I looked at my very good friend, and then at that point, my partner, and said to him, why don't I be their representation? I had been saying for years that people need a better representation, and I made the choice right then to do that. I had always, before entering in the foster care system, done well in school, and I certainly had the motivation, and you have to start somewhere. So I started researching how to go back to university, and I looked at where are these people coming from who were able to make this big macro level change. And I found that time and time again that people were coming from Harvard or Yale. So I made that choice. I said, you know what, I need to go to Harvard or Yale. And maybe I was a bit bright-eyed at that time, and I don't think I fully understood how difficult that really is, but I had my sights set on that. So I decided to go back to the community college that I started at back when I had that child, when I was just a teenager, and can complete that 2-year degree. So I went back to the community college, Rochester Community and Technical College, and quickly became elected student president, where me and myself and a team of people drafted an act to provide emergency food aid for students on campus. And this came about after first me surveying the student body population, and then just having a lot of conversations with students and realizing that they were hungry. Like, people were really, really hungry. And it was impossible to learn or to be able to progress academically when they didn't even have access to enough basic needs resources. And this is the point at which my path started shifting towards food security focus. So I drafted that act, and it passed unanimously, and the university community came together to support students in their food needs, serving hot meals on campus, providing snacks and food in strategic locations that were easily accessible. And it really was the faculty, the administration, the students, we all just came together and did that. And then, being student president, I also had access to be a part of the larger platform. It's called Lead MN, where community college students connect for change. And we're able to lobby the government to make bigger changes. So I was able to put on that platform, on that advocacy body platform, food security as a focus, and that later became the Minnesota Hunger-Free Campus Act that was signed by Governor Walz after I had left. I then graduated in 2018, transferred to Yale University, and decided to focus my studies on global affairs. And initially, what I wanted to study was constitutional law, because I wanted to focus domestically. I felt the way that people were treated was unconstitutional. But after going on a trip to Guatemala, where I helped build houses and stoves for people who were really impoverished, I quickly realized that the problems of people not having enough, and that being treated like a crime, poverty being treated like a crime, crossed borders and also was a timeless issue. I realized that I needed to have more of a macro approach. So that's what made me focus on global affairs. I still wasn't sure what my direction was, but it further narrowed on food security and conflict, because when I was taking a class at Yale, a professor said to me, so there is no way, like she said to me, and I was alarmed, because to me it was common knowledge that food insecurity of course causes people to fight. People will fight if they don't have their basic needs met. So I wrote this paper, and it was based on research, substantive research, and it was how food insecurity or failure of crops seemed to correlate with an increase in conflict in certain settings, mostly sub-Saharan Africa. She looked at me and she said, "There's absolutely no way that food insecurity causes conflict. That is just ridiculous." And it was in that moment that I realized two things. One, that there was this disconnect between people who were in positions of making policies and in positions of power, and what suffering actually means for people who they're trying to touch through these policies. And these are good people. And it's not all of them. But there was just this information gap that they struggled to connect. And then I really understood, okay, so here is a barrier to people having their needs met. And it really kind of illustrated that to me. And then the second thing was, well, I needed to prove food insecurity causes conflict then, because that seems pretty foundational in making sure people are okay, for them to have access to their basic needs: clean drinking water, healthy foods, adequate health care, safe housing, all seemed basic, and it didn't seem like we could get to the next level until we were able to really secure people in their basic needs. And the first step to that was proving that it's critical. So, and how do you prove that it's critical? And that kind of moved me over to studying national security. So I quickly realized, or at the end of my academic career at Yale, I realized that what I really wanted to do wasn't really law, it was more policy. And now I had this theoretical knowledge and understanding of what issues in national security are and policy. I didn't really know how to practically apply that in a real world setting. So I decided then to go to Stanford. I ended up getting into the Masters of International Policy program, where I continued my studies in food security through the lens of national security. And then when I thought about my career following that degree, or like during that degree when I was talking to the careers woman there, I realized that what really mattered was impact, and how could I have the most impact. And that was in being an expert in my field, so that I could really talk about food insecurity and how that is a motivator for conflict. And to do that, to have that broad impact, I needed to get a PhD. And so I applied to PhD programs, and I accepted an offer from Oxford University to study a PhD in international relations and focus on my project of interest, which is proving that food insecurity causes conflict, which will enable us to shift that over to a central policy concern for, like, on the global level, which will make it so that we can actually address it. And yeah, so I mean, that's a broad overview. I feel like there's a lot that I can talk about in there. There's a lot of different pieces of that, but that is my journey, my overview of my journey from a homeless young woman and foster child who experienced an insane amount of trauma, to somebody who is now pursuing a PhD at Oxford University. And at the heart of that is making sure that people are okay. Anyway, please let me know if you have any additional questions or comments, and if you want to hear more focus stories on these different aspects of that outline journey, and along with tips and tools on how to move from your situation and towards an end goal that's unique to you, please follow and like this video. Thanks a lot. Bye.